We're into our summer theme, and I like the summer theme idea. This has actually taken a lot of pressure off me in a lot of ways to be able to imagine a theme that will unify the summer without feeling like every week has to perfectly build on the previous week, and if you're not remembering what's going on, then you're going to miss things and all that. Like I kind of like the idea that I'm allowed to miss and you're allowed to miss because it's summer and we only get like 2 months that are nice in Michigan, so you should probably do things while it's nice. And our summer theme this year is becoming a peacemaker. And I've really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed preparing it. I've enjoyed thinking through it. It's something that is a bit of a passion project for me anyway. And last week I got to introduce that theme, talking about the difference between a peacemaker and a peacekeeper. And I told you that a peacekeeper is somebody who looks at the status quo and says, I want things to remain like this. This is what I want. Maybe there is some kind of tenuous peace, or there is something that is desirable by the body who has decided that we need peacekeepers to maintain this status quo. That is different from a peacemaker. A peacemaker looks at a situation and says, this situation is not as it ought to be. I am going to act to change it. And I pointed out how kind of funny it is that my definition of peacemaker is someone who stirs up conflict. But I tried to nuance that last week by saying the peacemaker is not the one who's stirring up the conflict. The peacemaker is the one who is not afraid to address a conflict that is happening. Right? The peacemaker is the one bold enough to not pretend that things are okay when they're not. Because it'd be a lot easier if we just got to sweep everything under the rug, not worry about things, especially when we're in conflict with other people, because there's a lot of conflict in the world that we can't address. How are you going to be a peacemaker about situations that you're not even aware are occurring in other parts of the world? Right? The world is too large, and communication is too broad. We know about things that we can't actually affect in any meaningful way. But we do have plenty of things that we can affect. And as peacemakers, as those who are called to be God's peacemakers, and we're promised in the Beatitudes that peacemakers will be called children of God. Hope I got that right. I didn't actually write that down. There's a lot of blessings in the Beatitudes. Go read that. Come to our Sunday school class. We're doing the Beatitudes in Sunday school. But the calling to be peacemakers is the calling to not be afraid of conflict, to be willing to risk entering into conflict that already is happening or that does exist or that we're involved with and say, I'm going to make peace here. I'm going to change the status quo, which is conflict. And too often I think we get wrapped up in the idea of being peacekeepers, where we say the status quo is there's an underlying level of tension between me and this other person, and if I don't address it, it probably won't get worse. So I'm going to keep the peace and just let it be. That's not what we're called to. We're called to be the kind of people that promote peace in our lives, in the world, in our church, in our wherever we are. Everything we touch has more peace as a result of us being there. And we saw through the example of Jesus that is directly resulted from the confrontation of things that are not right. And so then, after I got done talking about the difference between peacemakers and peacekeepers, I told you that we're going to cover some topics specifically, that the intention of this series is to be practical, and that we're going to cover active listening, which is today, apologizing like a Christian, and I did put that extra bit of nuance on there on purpose, apologizing like a Christian, and then de-escalation. Because sometimes we find ourselves in conflict and we need to figure out how to prevent it from getting worse. We also can be the third party that de-escalates conflict between other people. All of these things involve risk. Being willing to apologize is to make yourself vulnerable. Active listening takes work. De-escalation involves an entirely different kind of risk that we'll talk about a couple weeks from now, or several weeks from now. And so we get to touch on these things periodically throughout the summer while we have other things happening. We're going to give a full report on the Impact mission trip that's coming up. After Impact, we will do an Impact Sunday. I'm excited to be able to share pictures and stories about what happened on that trip. We want to keep you in the know about that trip and about its effectiveness, because we want to, as a church, begin to explore the possibility of partnering with them in greater detail. I'm not going to verbally commit to anything more than that right now. It's a powerful mission. Our kids learned a lot, saw a lot, did a lot, and we're excited about what they're doing in the city. So we want to find out how we can do more with them. And so I want to tell you about that. And so that's going to come up here in a couple weeks. But this week we have active listening. And I'm excited about active listening because I think this is intensely. Cool. Please turn to James chapter 1. I see, I'm the problem. I never should have imagined otherwise. Yeah. How many of you have ever heard of active listening before, just by show of hands? I don't mean like could teach it from the front in a class, but have heard of it.
Wait, what did you say it was?
Yeah. Got him. Thanks, Sam. Active listening has faded, well, let me call it, active listening has trickled down from the field of psychology into what I'll call pop psychology. Not all pop psychology is inherently bad, despite the fact that that title seems to have a negative connotation. The reason that we think of pop psychology as not necessarily being all that good most of the time, enough disclaimers there? I think maybe I could squeeze a few more in, but I'll hold off. We have examples like how our society has embraced the words "I feel." In the field of psychology, there is an incredibly helpful and useful tool and technique called using "I feel" statements to describe the way that you're feeling so that the other person can understand how their actions are affecting you. It's a way to describe your situation, your status quo, if you will, without making any accusations or any evaluations or any assumptions about the other person. You are taking responsibility for how your situation is affecting you. The other person might be doing things that are having an effect on you, but you use an "I feel" statement to leave them out of it and just say, "I feel hurt. I feel scared." Right? These things are feelings. But as this trickled down from the upper echelon of trained psychologists down into pop psychology, now we say things like, "I feel like you're really annoying," which is decidedly not a feeling. That's an assessment or a judgment or a thought. "I think you're annoying," it might be a true statement. "I feel like you're annoying" is kind of like saying, "Do you walk to school or carry your lunch?" That is a totally nonsensical thing. But our society has embraced it because it understands the value of "I feel" statements, and also our society has latched onto something that's really interesting that also accompanies the psychological principle. If I feel this way, you can't take away my feeling, it's mine. So if I tell you, "I feel like you're really annoying," there's nothing at all that you can say in response to that because it's just how I feel. Well, that's just how I feel. You can't get mad at me for how I feel. I feel like that. Right? And in this way, this psychological principle that is intensely useful, that we will talk about in the coming weeks, ends up being corrupted into something that was sort of the opposite of what it was intended to do. "I feel" statements become a blank check for you to say whatever you want without consequences, which is the exact opposite intention of how they're supposed to function in conflict resolution. But active listening, interestingly enough, has not had the same treatment. There's probably a lot of what you have heard or already know about active listening that is really accurate and useful and good. So I want to affirm that if you've heard of active listening, you're probably already on the right track. I'm probably not going to say a whole lot that will surprise you this morning, but I want to give you a complete picture. I want to give you tools, I want to give you ways to assess and evaluate yourself, and I want you to be able to understand what active listening is and how it can be useful in conversation and in conflict. So that's the goal this morning. So hopefully you're in James by now. Oh, I didn't tell you verses. James 1:19. James 1:19. I think that this biblical principle sets us up for a conversation about active listening in a really, really helpful way. This is James 1:19 and 20. "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." That's it. Let me break this down for you as simply as I possibly can. Being quick to listen and being being quick to listen and being slow to anger are opposites. You can't be quick to anger and quick to listen. You have to do them in this order. God does not want anger to be part of your relationships because it does not bear the kind of righteous fruit that God desires. So many of you will immediately have this gut reaction that anger is normal and it's how I feel, and God says don't sin when you're angry, but anger is allowed. The New Testament has nothing good to say about anger. It is only an unhelpful thing that gets in the way for you. Don't sin while you're angry is the concession that yes, it will happen, but it's almost always destructive, so you need to be really careful with how it's used. When Paul gives his vice and virtue list, one of the things that he includes in his vice list, put away anger, maliciousness, deceit. List goes on, right? The The opposite of being quick to listen is being quick to get angry, and being quick to get angry is the fastest way to increase conflict. So as we're talking about active listening as a principle and as a concept, active listening is the choice instead of anger. That's how I'm going to set it up this morning. You're going to enter into conflict with other people who are going to say things to you like, I feel like you're really annoying. And it would be easy to get angry at that because that's rude, it's inconsiderate, it's not really true, it's not a statement that really works, it's a direct affront to who you are as a person, right? It would be normal and natural to get angry about that. But instead, we are called to be quick to listen because anger does not produce the kind of righteousness that God desires. Active listening is a tool for increasing, if not producing, righteousness in you. And not just in you, but in your relationships. Because let's assume that you as a human being are going to be out in the world interacting with other people. And that as part of that interaction, you're going to enter conversations with people. I think that that's probably a pretty safe assumption for every person in the room. Through the act of entering those conversations, you're going to have opportunities to either choose to get angry or to listen. Listening first sounds easy enough, but being a good listener is not always intuitive. There are habits that we may have formed over time. There's things that we may do that actually prevent us from being good listeners. And I think that there's some really easy ways to root those out and to identify what they are. And I actually have them listed in order, and I'm going to talk about them soon. Let me define active listening because I keep just throwing this term out like people know what it means. I don't expect you to know what it means until this moment. Active listening is a communication technique where you give a person your full attention and respond to what that person is saying. Does that sound easy enough? You might even say things like, give them your undivided attention. Active listening implies a component in which you are exerting effort because you are being active while you are listening. Now, taking our assumption that you're a regular human being who will probably at some point enter conversation with other human beings, some of those conversations will involve conflict. Some of them will just be new people or strangers that you've never met before, and now you're trying to make a good impression on them. They might be conflicts that you're overhearing that don't involve you at all, like someone wants to share something they're going through with you or something like that. I have 6 things that I want to share with you. If you're the note-taker person, this is your moment, right? Get your pencils out. We're going to go through them. I'm not just going to list them all out. We're going to go through them one at a time. I have 6 things to share with you about how to do active listening and how to know that you're doing it well. But before I give you the list, I want to give you one last disclaimer. This is not a smorgasbord list where you pick and choose the ones that you like and you go, oh, I'm good at that one. Good, I'm an active listener. That's great. This is a complete picture of active listening. All 6 of these need to be done. So that if you identify one that you're not all that good at, that's fine. That's what this whole thing is about. You go, oh, good, that's the one that I need to work on. But we don't get to kind of do the what we did with the spiritual gifts inventories in the late 90s and early 2000s and go, I scored really low on mercy. That means I'm totally allowed to be a jerk because God didn't bless me with that. Did any of you ever hear things like that? Because I totally did, and so did Eric, because we came through education in that era. But this is not a pick and choose list. This is the complete picture of what active listening looks like. So you will be good at some of these, and you will struggle with others, and that's okay, normal, and expected. So first, ask open-ended questions. If you are an active listener, then you need to ask open-ended questions. You can collect information with closed-ended questions, but that does not promote further conversation. Now you might be like, what's a closed-ended question? Closed-ended questions have simple answers, like yes, or no, or 23. Did you go to the store yesterday? Yes. What did you get from the store yesterday? List, right? One of these questions, one of these ways of asking a question promotes a bigger answer. So now you're in a situation where somebody is coming to you to share a conflict or a struggle that they're going through. You have 2 ways you can ask a question about that. Has this been going on a long time? Yes. Okay. Now the impetus is on me to come up with the next thing that happens in the conversation. I didn't put the ball in their court. I rebounded off them to keep the ball in my court. Right? You see how that works. They answered my question, and now they are waiting to see what comes next from me because I'm the one in the driver's seat. What if instead of, has this been going on a long time, what if you ask, how long has this been going on? They get to use their own words now to describe how long it's been going on. They might say, oh, it's been going on a really long time, 2 days, and I'm just dying. And you're kind of like, oh, okay, I have some context for what we're dealing with here. Or they might say 40 years, and you go, whoa. Now, right now I have a definition for what they think a long time means. I have an understanding of where their feelings are at about how long it's been. Maybe they would say, nah, it's not been going on for very long, only a couple years. I get those kinds of answers from people like my dad, where I'm like, he'll be like, oh, and I'm like, oh, what, you got like a pain in your knee? He's like, yeah, I kind of tweaked it. I'm like, oh, has that been hurting a while? He's like, no, just, yeah, like 3 Christmases ago, I was out on the driveway and slipped. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a long time for me, but okay. You're tougher than I am, which is, yeah. You get, by asking this open-ended question, you get to get their perspective, more information, puts the ball in their court, and they now get to communicate. And as a side note, I do think that this is part of the reason that some adults have struggled historically to communicate with younger people, like teens especially. You might ask, there's so many, okay, let me just stick to the script. Did you have a good day at school? Right, that's a question that I have heard get asked before. Right, a parent or somebody is like, did you have a good day at school? And they're like, yes. And then the parent is like, oh, my child just won't open up to me. And it's kind of like you've sort of been set up to fail in that situation. If you can become a good question asker, you can get more information and begin to have a conversation or a dialogue. Now, that's not to say that you might ask an open-ended question like, how was school today? And your child might say, good, and turn around and walk away. That can still happen because they might opt out of having a conversation with you, and then you would be right to say, my child just won't open up with me. But there are ways that you can then get around that. If you're using good active listening techniques, you can continue to ask open-ended questions to cue this person in to the fact that I am interested in your answer. Because we have trained young people by how we talk to each other that when you ask the question, how are you doing? Nobody cares. Nobody cares about the answer. Right, so you might, if you're starting with like a younger person, you actually want to have a conversation about how their day at school was. You might lead with, hey, can we sit down and talk about school for just a couple minutes? I really want to hear about how it's been going. And then it's like, oh, okay, sure. And then you sit down like, how was school today? And they might say good. And you might say, what was good? And then you get the conversation kind of rolling, right? And you can see how just your perspective and values and goals from the beginning as an active listener can change the shape of that conversation. Being a passive listener, I guess, so I've just sort of coined that term just now, you might be doing the dishes, they walk in the door, you don't look at them and you go, how was school? And they say good, you don't make eye contact, they walk through the room and you never saw each other, right? Like those kinds of interactions can happen and just become culturally normal for your family or your household or whatever. You can break that, I think, with active listening, and you can be the kind of person who promotes sharing, to discover where conflict might arise so that you can be an agent for peacemaking. If you discover that your child or your friend's child is going through something real or serious, you now know because you cared enough to ask and have a conversation and listen to what their answers were. Okay? Ask open-ended questions. That's number 1. Number 2, clarify. If a person has engaged you in conversation, you have permission to be a participant in that conversation. If they say something that you don't quite know what they mean, you can just ask them what they meant. That's allowed. So often I hear things like, well, I tried to kind of have a conversation, but I didn't really want to pry. And it's like, well, if they've engaged you in conversation, or even if you've engaged them in conversation and they've reciprocated, you now have entered the social contract where it's okay to ask questions and collect information. You're not prying anymore. You're just talking like humans. And if they say something you're not totally sure what they mean, just ask, what did that mean? What did you mean by that? Can you tell me more about that? I'm not sure I understand that. What does that feel like? Also open-ended questions. See what I did there? I was in a situation a little while ago where a person that I was talking to used this phrase that scares me. And maybe it's my baggage or maybe it's normal, but they just said, I just don't know how much longer I can take this. That phrase just terrifies me. I don't like how it feels. I don't like what it implies about how a person is feeling themselves. And so I asked. I just said, what did you mean when you said, I don't know how much longer I can take this? And they were like, oh man, like this, I don't really want to share it too much, but let's just hypothetically say it was my job, right? Oh man, my job is just driving me crazy. I might have to quit my job soon. I'm going to start looking for another job. And it's kind of like, oh, okay, right? They could tell by the question that I asked suddenly, oh, you thought I meant, oh, I should have picked my words more carefully. No, I was not considering taking my own life. And now they're embarrassed, and it's kind of like, oh man, no, I should be more conscientious of the word choice that I use when I'm trying to describe just this kind of mundane work situation. And then I, as the active listener, get to go, oh, no. I just care about you so much that I don't want that to happen to you. Like, this is not a conflict. This was a miscommunication. I just didn't know. This was my thing. All right? And we got to have this open dialogue where I just was like, you know what? I really love you. I don't want these things to happen to you. And it was a kind of a silly miscommunication. There's nothing actually happening here. But now we know that. And everybody walks away just like, yeah, this was better. And because I clarified, I have no worry. I have no fear about what might be going on. I'm not concerned. I don't regret anything. Oh, I really should have followed up on that. Because I asked, I clarified. I was given permission to participate in a conversation because they had a conversation with me. You see how that works? Okay, we've got another one. Clarify, that's number 2. Reflect. Number 3, reflect. I really like this one because I think it could potentially be the easiest one. Reflecting is where you just repeat back a word or phrase that person used. Really simple example that probably comes up in your life regularly. Oh man, work is really crazy right now. Crazy? Oh yeah, there's all this, and then floodgates open and you hear about work for the next 10 minutes, whether you want to or not. Right? You know what I'm talking about. That was not hard. That was not a hard thing to do. I just heard an imprecise word used to describe a situation that a person I cared about was experiencing. Right, here is this other human who's going through life and struggling with a lot of the same things I'm struggling. I love them. I care about them. As a peacemaker, I want good things for them. They use an imprecise word to describe a situation they're facing. It's crazy. I don't know what that means. Crazy? By just reflecting back to them what they said, they recognize that that's an incomplete version of the story, and they tell you. Or they don't. Maybe they're withholding, and then you can use other active listening techniques like open-ended questions to pursue that more, find out what's going on, find out if there's something more serious laden in. But all of this is active. You see, like we're halfway through our list, and you see how much work this requires. This is not just like sidelines. I get to be good at this by virtue of the fact that I am a Christian. This takes work and effort. It's not necessarily easy, and it's not always easy to know exactly which one of these things is happening and when. Right? Reflect gets to be a little bit different than clarifying, though, because the example that I used for reflecting almost sounds like, can you clarify what you meant by crazy? But they function a little bit differently. In that clarification is about clearing up a misunderstanding in the conversation. Reflecting is just an invitation for them to continue expanding on the thought. Right? This has been difficult. Difficult. Not a question even, right? Like you have engaged the words that they used. This is their word choice. It's not like you have to be creative here. And you are now inviting them to continue telling you about what's going on. It's an invitation to expand. All right, so we have open-ended questions, we have clarify, we have reflect. Now 4th, summarize. This is sort of the exact opposite of reflect, and it's the one that I think is perhaps the hardest and the one that might take the most work. And at the popular level, summarize I think is what most people interpret active listening to mean. What I mean when I say summarize is you have to listen closely enough to what they're saying that you can repeat it back to them in your own words. Now you're not using their words, you're using your own creativity to try and capture the situation in a way that reflects that you understand what they said. By using different words, you show that you are communicating the same message actively. You have to engage their message to think through how to explain it differently than they explained it. And if you are not right, they get to explain that to you. Summarizing ends up also being a bit of an invitation to elaborate, but often when you summarize and you get it right, they'll just, with relief and a sigh of just elation, just go, yes, like you get it. You know, when you do it correctly, you land on the right point, they are relieved. They know that you heard them. They have no doubts anymore about whether you understand. Right, so somebody might go through a long and complicated story about their coworker. And there's a lot of complaining, a lot of like hurt feelings, a lot of maybe not real precise I feel statements, and you're trying to sift through all of this stuff, and you're trying to figure out how to summarize it back to them so that you can prove that you care and that you're listening. They get through this long, elaborate story with your coworker, and you say, sounds like your coworker might be taking advantage of your hard work. And they go, yeah, that's exactly what's happening. Man, you get it. And then you get to go from there because you've demonstrated that you're on the same page, you understand, and they know that you know where they're going. Right? The temptation when you're trying to summarize is to make assessments. And this has to be avoided pretty much at all costs. They get through their long, elaborate, complicated story about their coworker, and you say, that doesn't sound like a big deal. You should probably just get over that. And here's what's crucial. That might be true. You might be right. They might be overreacting to something that is not a big deal. But that is not how active listening works. Because if they are going to draw the conclusion, I am overreacting, this is not a big deal, it has to be their idea. You know that? Have you seen that? Have you been the person who's like, you're overreacting, and they just shut down? They never talk to you about their problem again. You never hear any follow-up or feedback about how it went. And you just are like, oh, good, they got over it. That must be resolved. Hopefully you're not dense enough and you recognize that's what has happened. You can't be the one that just swoops in and kicks them in the teeth when they're trying to vent frustration to you. If you see that something is a little crooked, it's not your job to reach out and straighten it out. It's your job to help them appreciate the crookedness. And then, maybe, if they grant you permission, you work together to find solutions. But you need to get to a full, comprehensive understanding of their situation before you have the right to offer solutions. I don't even care how they're feeling about it. I am telling you, as a Christian peacemaker, you don't have the right to offer solutions to things you don't understand. You are summarizing back to them because it's effective and also because of what it does to you. You need to understand them and their situation before you, like a child swinging a bat in the dark, wander into their life and hit things that aren't piñatas. You have to gain understanding or your advice is worse than meaningless, it's dangerous. And this is where active listening, I think, becomes so important. Summarize. Number 4. Number 5. Give words of encouragement. Give words of encouragement. This one can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. What I mean by give words of encouragement are those verbal and sometimes even nonverbal prompts for them to keep going and that you're listening. Yeah. Oh, I see. Engage. Engage them in a way that they can tell that you're engaged. Right? If you are the stoned-faced person who listens like this, they're going to just begin to wonder whether you're even hearing them or not, right? And you might go, no, I'm listening. Right? You have to give some kind of encouragement for them to continue. You have to give some kind of encouragement that you are actually awake and hearing them. And while you're doing that, you have to avoid the other extreme, which is the double-edged sword, where you feel the pressure to fill all the silences in the conversation. Active listening makes room for silence because silence is where processing happens. If the other person says something really heavy and really deep, you acknowledge it, you give words of encouragement, wow, or yeah, and then wait. That might be the best gift you could ever give them. While you're waiting silently, all of the emotional support of your presence is there with none of the distraction of your words, and they get to work through how they're feeling, what they're going through, and how it's affecting them. Churning and bubbling beneath the surface in ways that you can't see, but you have to be comfortable with silence to be an active listener. You have to know when to be silent and when to say things, when to offer these words of encouragement for them to continue, but also when to let them process and think. As you're figuring out how to do that, ask clarifying questions. If you're not sure if this is a moment where you should shut your mouth, you could just be like, do you want a minute to think about that? Is that really so weird to communicate like that with each other? Is that really so strange? To just give the other person permission to say, yeah, I'd like you to not talk for a little bit. I don't think that it is, but somehow in our social contract, in our society, it's become very strange. Like we're not allowed to ask those blunt questions as though they're offensive or hurtful or something. It's the opposite. If we're peacemakers and we care about people, we wade into conflict and try to help. If you're not sure if it should be a silent moment, you should ask, hey, should this be a silent moment? And then they can be like, oh, no, I just kind of got distracted because we're, at B-dubs and there's TVs everywhere or something, because that happens to me all the time. Give words of encouragement. Number 5. All right, our last one. And I love this one. React. React in the conversation. If you are the one that they've chosen to include in your conflict, or you are involved in the conflict in some way, you do not have to remain completely neutral as though you're some sort of robot who's detached from their situation or reality. It's sort of the opposite. Reacting is your opportunity to demonstrate empathy. Right? And empathy is our ability to imagine what it would be like to feel or experience the thing that they're feeling or experiencing. It's our ability to put ourselves in their perspective, to imagine what it would be like if X, Y, and Z. And by reacting, when they are frustrated, being frustrated too, when they are sad, being sad too, by reacting with appropriate reactions to the kind of things that they're saying, you get to enter into that space with them empathetically and be the kind of support and encouragement that they need. And it's super easy. When somebody says, I'm super frustrated about this thing at work that keeps happening because so-and-so keeps coming into my area or leaving their fingernail clippings on my desk or whatever other gross or weird thing, react. Oh, that's so gross. Who would do that? That is so terrible. Right? You're not making any assessments. You're wrong for feeling that way. That person is a horrible person. The world is broken and terrible and awful and everything sucks. Right? It doesn't have to be like that. You can just be with them in it. That sounds really hard. I would be frustrated by that too. How do you deal with that? That's so obnoxious. Right? An appropriate reaction to match what they're actually saying is active listening. You don't have to be just this stoic robot who just waits for the end and then you come in, swoop in with open-ended questions and skillful rhetoric or something. Be a human being. Active listening is about being a human being and entering the human condition with another human being or multiple other human beings. All right, so these are my 6 points. React is number 6. These are my 6 points. This is how active listening works. If you bumped into one as you were going through that you're like, I'm not very good at that one, think on that, pray on that, work on that. Send me an email. How do I do this better? All right, let's get lunch. I love food. We can talk about it. I will show you how active listening works. Now that I have told you about how all this works, you are going to totally bust me when we're having conversations in the future, and you're going to go, oh, there's that active listening stuff. Because I do this with every person I ever meet. You know why? Because I think that's what Jesus is like. And it's kind of that simple for me. I think Jesus cares enough about people to be curious about them, to be curious about their situation. It's not because we're so star-spangled awesome, let's go be active listeners so everyone can go, look how awesome these people are. It's because this works to promote peace. This is how I think Christ would do it in today's society. And there's plenty of examples, I think, in Scripture of how Christ does demonstrate active listening, but I didn't want to get too bogged down in that. If you're curious for a biblical example, please read Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well, how he hears her questions and responds. She changes the subject, he follows her. He reacts to her questions, he reacts to her awe over him being a prophet, right? It's a great story. If you want to study through that sometime, just let me know, but I opted not to do that this morning. I want more concise tidbits that you can take away today. So with that in mind, I want to share a couple Proverbs with you. Proverbs 18:2. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. How many of you had someone jump directly into your mind? Hopefully not you. You're like, Todd. Oh, no, gosh. Hopefully not. Let me give you another one. Proverbs 18:13. To answer before listening, that is folly and shame. It's not just a mistake, it's shameful. Be better. Be better than that. Now, I have something. I want to close on this. I have a quiz. It's terrible. I have a quiz that I read through and I was like, that's awesome. Am I an active listener? Let's find out. Answer these questions in your mind. Prayerfully consider these questions. I'm just going to read through them, give you just a moment to think about it, and then read all the way to the end. There's like 6 of them. And then I'm just going to close and pray. I want to leave you with this quiz. Do I allow the speaker to finish without interrupting? Do I listen between the lines for subtext? Do I repeat what the person said just to clarify the meaning? Do I avoid getting hostile or agitated when I disagree with the speaker? Do I tune out distractions when listening? Do I make an effort to seem interested in what the other person is saying? Let's pray. God, one of the titles that you've claimed on yourself is Prince of Peace. And we got to talk about that a little bit last week, but we pray that that truth would sink in a way that's beyond whatever words I can share up here. That you would shape us as your people to be advocates for peace, that we would be peacemakers, that we would have that peaceful effect everywhere that we go. And we talked about some skills this morning. I pray that you would cause this time to be memorable to people in a way that they can apply. I pray that you would convict us of the areas that we're weak, that you would turn us into better listeners so that we can be agents of your peace in this world. God, help us to be like your Son. Help us to serve you in this way. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.